EME 70 comes with everything you see here. You get all the expected stuff like the ignition and mufflers, but you also get something different. Mile High RC includes a set of NGK spark plugs like we all go to anyway, and EME throws in a spark plug wrench. How can they get away with something that makes that much sense? The prop bolt pattern is the same thing as like the DA50s and DLE 55s. Overall, everything on this engine is very cleanly made. Also note the angled spark plugs. Some of the other motor companies seem to think you'll be willing to pay extra for something like angled spark plugs because it makes it fit in the airplane better. And this motor comes ready for an electric onboard starting system that you can get from Mile High RC. If this carburetor and the reddish reed block below it look familiar, that's because it should be. This is a genuine Walbro carburetor that's considered to be one of the best on the market. The EME 70 mounted right up to the same holes that used to hold my DA50 on. And the included standoffs were perfect for my plane. If this is beginning to sound like it was an easy installation, that's because it really was. I used to have my flight batteries inside the motor box, but because I had to move them back to correct the CG, I was able to put the ignition module inside. I can't see how it's going to hurt anything to protect this ignition module from the heat of the motor. The safest way to run the fuel line is through the floor of the motor box and to the carburetor that way. And I put some of that silicone armor wrap around the fuel line where it goes through the hole to protect it. I refuse to put another servo in to work a choke that I can reach, so I always make up a linkage like this. I use a ball link like this because it's very secure and it doesn't rattle. I'm from the old 72 megahertz days, and a piece of wire rattling in a metal arm like this could screw up the radio back then. And I'm just not going to take a chance of it happening now. Plus, this kind of linkage doesn't fall off. I also use the ball lines on throttle linkage, so it's both very secure and it's very precise because there's no play at all in this linkage. I have a story on my website about what I'm doing here to replace the gaskets that come with all motors. This is a high temperature silicone gasket material. The instructions say to cover both surfaces. Put it together with the screws and just draw the screws down just tight enough that you can see this gasket material starting to ooze out. Then you leave it sit for an hour. Then after the gasket material's had an hour to set up, we go back and tighten up the bolts. I've not had an exhaust leak or an exhaust bolt come loose since I started using this procedure. With everything but the fuel installed, I moved the yak to my easy balancer. And what surprised me about this is that it was actually pretty close to in balance. I wound up moving the flight batteries to bay just about in the center of the cockpit, and that did the trick. I'll do the final balance testing when I get it in the air. And this really is the first time I fired up the EME 70 at the field. I'm still getting used to how much this motor wants to choke on and how much it wants it off. And that's all going to change as the motor breaks in, more than likely. But I hope it always stays this easy to start. I always let my motor sidle a little bit to make sure to get some heat on the inside. One of the first things I noticed about the EME 70 is that it doesn't like the throttle to be advanced while it's still cold. We could play around with the adjustment screws to try and get rid of that, but seeing how this motor is brand new, I'm just going to run it like this and let everything wear itself in so we're dealing with the right kind of air speeds inside the motor. Once the EME 70 warmed up, it's been very reliable, and I haven't had to adjust the idle on it since. Now that we have some heat in the motor, it's time to clear it out and take it up in the air. When I'm breaking in a motor like this, I try and vary the throttle a whole bunch while I'm in the air, and to never run it at full speed for more than a few seconds. One of my favorite things to do with a new motor is to do touch and goes, because that gives you a good combination of power on and then power off where the motor can cool down again. I also had to trim this yak out because I had changed all of the controls over. But it was real close and the motor kept running fine, so he just kept flying around and taking it easy with the motor. One of the other things we can play with while we're breaking the motor in is to do elevators and stuff to re-get the motor idled down. It just breaks up the monotony. As strong as the EME 70 is right out of the box, it only takes a few seconds of vertical to get me up where I can do a decent elevator back down. And I started doing stuff like this because I was so sure of the motor. This thing just ran great right out of the box. All of this video is from the first weekend that I flew the EM70. Altogether, there's got to be 20 to 25 10-minute flights on this motor now. When I do touch and goes with a new motor, I try and go from wide open throttle down to idle all at one time when I'm close enough to make the field if it does actually quit. But I did that dozens and dozens of times with the EM70 this first week and never faltered once. If you listen close, you can hear during some of these landings that I'm giving the motor just a little bump of power now and then to extend the glide. And this motor responds to that very well. There's no stumbling, nothing. It just picks up the RPM a little bit like I want it. I'm showing so much that has to do directly with throttle response because frankly I'm amazed at this motor. I've never had a motor that run this well right out of the box. Now I don't think a motor is bad because you need to adjust the carburetor when you take it out of the box. But this one seems like it was bullseyed at the factory. And despite all the flights I put on it, I haven't had to adjust anything. So stay tuned. Segment 2 of this review will be coming out in a while after we get some more time to get this motor broken in.